since the result of those elections will have very important bearing on the North Korea policy as well as the Iraq-U.S. Alliance relationship. For the sake of addressing those questions in depth, we have invited two distinguished speakers from CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. The first speaker is Dr. John Hamney, who is President and CEO of CSIS. As you may know, he served as a Deputy Secretary of Defense during the Bill Clinton administration. And the second speaker is Professor Victor Cha, who is a Senior Advisor and a Korea Chair at CSIS, and also he is a Professor and Vice Dean at the School of Foreign Service of Georgetown University. He also, Victor Cha, served as Asian Affairs Director at National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration. Am I correct, Victor?
Yes.
Okay. So today's session consists of three parts. The first which is to listen to brief remarks or presentation from two speakers, maybe 7 to 10 minutes respectively. Then I will ask some questions to each of you to provoke some further discussions. And finally, I will wrap up and adjourn today's session. Okay? Then without further ado, let me turn to Dr. John Hamney for 7 to 10 minutes for initial remarks.
Fine. Sung Han, are you able to hear me? I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Fine.
Yeah, can you speak up a little bit?
Yes, I will. And first of all, let me say thank you. I'm honored to have a chance to be with you. Sung Han, you're a good friend, and I've known you so many years, and I consider you to be one of the best thinkers in Korea.
Thank you.
And so it's a real privilege to be able to be here, especially with you personally. And let me say to my Korean friends, I have a deep affection for Korea. It's almost like my second country, and I have a very deep affection and regard for Korea and its future. And I want to say how proud I am for how well Korea has done handling the COVID pandemic. Korea has been on the forefront of handling this in the most effective way. And I contrast it with America. We have done a very poor job. It's embarrassing, actually, how poorly we've handled the pandemic. And I wish we would watch, listen, and follow Korea to deal with this pandemic. You've done such a much better job, and you've got a much more sophisticated approach to public health. And so I would like to say to all of my Korean friends how much I admire you, and thank you for the very superb job that you've done. You've given us a model for how we could handle this, and we're not following very well. And so I would like us to do a better job. You've charted the path, and I wish we could follow. Um, the pandemic has changed the American electoral landscape very profoundly. Normally, presidents when they run for reelection, almost always get reelected because there's such power in their incumbency. Uh, they command great resources. They're able to get the attention of the press at any time. They are able to shape the national debate at their will. So normally, an incumbent is highly, highly favored for reelection in any election. But the COVID pandemic has changed the landscape here fairly dramatically. Um, because we haven't handled it very effectively, uh, President Trump is very much on the defensive. And people are questioning deeply the competence of the federal government. Now, this is part of a larger debate that we're having. It's very much triggered by the pandemic, but there is a larger debate that is emerging, and that is the role of the federal government in national policy in America. And because America has done so poorly, Americans are questioning the capacity of the United States to be a leader. Um, in many ways, this becomes the debate that we're going to have in this election. Uh, is America still confident in itself and sufficiently strategic to be a leader of the global community? That is an open question now. Now, the Trump presidency has a focus overwhelmingly about America's domestic political construction. President Trump isn't so interested, frankly, in allies or in foreign policy. He's very interested in America's economy and how well we're doing and how well we're doing compared to others. The Democrats and Vice President Biden um, are primarily campaigning on a theme that they want to fix the problems that have been caused by President Trump. There is no real, uh, there's no really authentic new leadership ideas in the Biden campaign. If you look at the artifacts of the Biden campaign, what's in his website about his campaign, his positions, etc. It's almost overwhelmingly about two things. One is to correct the damage that they say that has been created by President Trump, and the other is climate change. Those are almost overwhelmingly the dimensions of the Biden campaign. Uh, so it is not going to be a, uh, a if President Biden is elected, and right now he's ahead. If President Biden is elected, he's not coming into office with great new ideas or an abundance of initiatives. He is coming into office as a conservative, in the sense he wants to conserve the what is the foreign policy of the past, not to lead in profound and dramatic new directions. I'm going to leave it to Dr. Cha to discuss the foreign policy implications of the campaign and of each of the candidates. I would just say on this is overwhelmingly a, a campaign about domestic American politics. Foreign policy is not a prominent element of this election. It is overwhelmingly about domestic sentiments and domestic attitudes about the role of the government in American life. And so long as we have both the pandemic the way we're handling the COVID pandemic. And the other issue, which is so prominent, is the issue of racial justice in America. The degree to which we realize that Black Americans, Brown Americans do not enjoy the same treatment or benefits or opportunities that white Americans have. These are the two dominant issues in this election, and they both share a common theme, and that is the diminished importance and role of the federal government. So I think you're going to see an election right now. If the election were tomorrow, um, Vice President Biden would win. Um, but it's still a long way off before we see the results of that. I think open for question is going to be the nature of America's role as an international leader going forward. I have my own personal views. Um, I personally feel that this is a pivot point for America, that we should be embracing a profoundly new international order, one where the center of gravity is in Asia. It's no longer in Europe; it's in Asia, and we should be embracing that and finding, to reestablishing the deep partnership that we have with friends like Korea. But this is going to be an election about America's domestic sentiment about its own future. And I think it's going to be a pivotal election. Let me turn to Dr. Cha. I think I spoke with Victor in advance, and I said I would set the landscape, but I would prefer to have him talk about a foreign policy. So, Dr. Kim, if it's okay, let me turn to Victor.
Okay, thank you, John. I think it was a good overview about the general atmosphere of the U.S. Presidential election and some key domestic dimensions that are, influencing the process of elections. Thank you very much. Now, Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Sangan. It's good to be with you and with John. And I'm happy to be part of the World Knowledge Forum, pre-World Knowledge Forum broadcast. So thanks very much, and good morning to the audience in Korea. Um, I think that where I'd like to start my comments is on an issue that I think will occupy the next presidency, whether it's Trump or Biden, and that is on North Korea. And then I think in the question and answer discussion, I can talk more about where I think the alliance is going relative to the election, because I know that you wanted to cover that as well. First, on North Korea, let me say, I guess where I would start is that I think Fitch predicted that the North Korean economy will contract by 6% this year, which will be the largest contraction of the economy since the famine in the mid 1990s. Um, the reason for this may be well known to some of the viewers. All of the rain and the flooding that has taken place in North Korea has really wiped out almost half of the terraced lands in the country and washed out a lot of the fertilizer treatment, which means there's going to be a very bad harvest in the fall and acute food insecurity for as much as 60% of the population, according to the US Department of Agriculture. The North Korean leader has visited Hamgyong province, where a lot of the flooding has occurred, and announced an emergency release of grain, which is a significant action because usually they don't announce those big release of grain stocks unless it's truly an emergency situation. Coupled with the food problem, of course, is the admitting by the government that there is COVID-19 inside the country. They blamed it on a defector who brought it in, but I think all of us believe that even though the North Korean regime said that they didn't have COVID in the country, that it was most likely there. Um, Kaesong has been shut down. But it's a public health system that is not able to handle a pandemic inside of the country. And the lockdown, as a result of the pandemic, has led to a decline in Sino-North Korean trade by as much as 70%. Um, so all of this means that the situation for North Korea is not good as we head into the U.S. election. Um, so that's the first point I wanted to make. The second is if we look at what a Biden administration or a Trump second term would have to deal with, it's going to be the problem of how to address the nuclear issue. And here, what I'd like to do is, if you could show the first slide, which is a very short 2-minute presentation on some research we've done at CSIS on North Korea's nuclear program.
We can see the slide. Yeah. 그 PPT 그 나오고 있어요.
Yeah, the first slide, which is a short video.
PDF.
Yes, next slide.
Okay. Next slide.
Yes, and play this. Yeah. Yeah, if they could just click and play that slide.
그 동영상 같은 거. 보낸 거. Okay.
The Pyeongsan uranium concentrate plant is located about 45 kilometers from the DMZ in North Korea. It produces uranium concentrate, or yellow cake, which is the feedstock to fuel North Korea's nuclear reactors, from which they reprocess fissile material, both plutonium and uranium based, for their nuclear weapons program. Our imagery shows that the Pyeongsan facility is quite active, and it appears to be growing in terms of its capacity as well.
At the main plant, some of the most notable activity has been the raising and construction of new facilities, the deterioration and replacement of roofs throughout the facility. Among the most notable activities seen are the expansion of tailings piles. Tailings piles are the rock that's left over after you actually extract the ore that contains the uranium in it. These are an indication of mining activity and show that mining activity has continued throughout the life of the plant. Within the tailings pile, we see a number of very interesting activities. We see, obviously, the increasing amount of precipitated solid waste that's being dumped into the pond. We also see a rising level of water within the pond.
It's hard to determine, based on the activity at this facility, how many nuclear weapons North Korea has. What we do know from looking at this facility is that its activity tells us that nuclear fuel continues to be produced for these reactors, which only means that they have the capacity to expand their nuclear bombs rather than give them up. Our satellite imagery of this facility shows how the diplomacy that took place in Singapore and Hanoi really was just a semblance of agreements when the actual activities by North Korea continued. So this plant has been in existence for a long time, but it has become more important in the context of policy because the Trump administration has been focused on getting North Korea to give up all of their nuclear weapons. But they cannot really give up all of their weapons without giving up the fuel for the reactors. And so any deal, whether it was at Singapore or Hanoi, must include this particular facility. Thanks. Thank you. So this is the uranium ore concentrate plant, which provides the feedstock for nuclear fuel for their reactors, from which they reprocess uranium or plutonium for nuclear weapons. The reason I wanted to show that particular video is to say that the next administration that deals with the problem of North Korea cannot simply go back to the same agreements that have been made in the past over one facility that we've known about, for four decades now. There are many other elements of the program, including the uranium concentrate plant, the yellow cake plant, that become important to any sort of real effort at either denuclearization of North Korea or even threat reduction when it comes to North Korea. If you could go to the next slide and the next one and the next one. One more. Okay.
Is that it?
Yes, that's it. And this is the final point that I wanted to make. So this is a interactive chart that shows the frequency of North Korean provocations during U.S. election years. The yellow lines represent presidential election years, and the blue lines represent congressional or by-election years. And so you can see, particularly within from about 2000 onwards, there is a much higher frequency of North Korean provocations during U.S. election years. In fact, this year, 2020, the first quarter of 2020, started out with as many provocations as we saw in the first quarter of 2017. 2017 was the year of fire and fury when North Korea, in the first 12 months of the Trump administration, did 20 ballistic missile tests and 1 nuclear test. So the point of all this is to say that I think that if North Korea behaves according to the way they normally would, we should expect to see them doing more provocations in the run-up to and after the November election here in the United States, which will force them onto the front burner for the next administration, whether it's a second Trump administration or whether it's a Biden administration. If in the run-up to the election and afterwards we do not see these sorts of provocations from North Korea like we normally would, then that would be a signal that there's something wrong inside the country, whether it has to do with the food problems or whether it has to do with COVID-19 or some sort of leadership issue, leadership sickness. If we don't see provocations according to the patterns we've seen in the past, then that might suggest these other things that I talked about at the beginning of my short presentation with regard to food problems, flooding, COVID-19, leadership sickness. These things might actually be having an impact on the regime. So I think, Sangan, with that, I'll just stop my initial remarks, and then I'd be happy to discuss other issues with regard to the election and its impact on the Korean Peninsula in our discussion.
Victor, fantastic. Particularly your video clip and the last slide were very interesting in the sense that North Korea, despite Singapore and Hanoi, has been continuing its nuclear development together with the upgrading of their ballistic missile capabilities. And the last part is the pattern of North Korean provocation before and after U.S. elections, which was very interesting. Against this backdrop, I think, let me ask, it is possible. If it is possible, how do you think it will be unfolded?
Sure. So when we talk about October surprise, it's the idea that there could be a fourth meeting between the leadership of the two countries, North Korea and the United States, and there could be some sort of interim or phase one. But the concept, I think, of the October surprise really, I think, became known to people as a result of John Bolton's book and his description of the Hanoi summit, in which the summit fell apart because North Korea was willing to give up Yongbyon in return for lifting all of the economic sanctions, which President Trump would not go for. But as John Bolton recounts in the book, at one point in Hanoi, the president actually says, well, what if we just released a portion of the sanctions? in return for what North Korea is offering. Um, and in the book, Bolton says this was the point at which his heart dropped into his stomach because he thought a deal could be done if that were the case. Now, in the end, the North Korean leadership could not respond to that offer, so no deal was reached. But the whole idea behind the October surprise is as we get closer to this election, and as Dr. Hamry said, in the United States here, the key issue is how poorly we have dealt with the pandemic. And President Trump is looking for some bit of good news, at least in his own mind, with regard to some other issue to distract the news cycle. It's not implausible that there could be some sort of deal, a partial lifting of sanctions in return for some sort of freeze at the Yongbyon nuclear facility, which he might claim to be a phase one deal, but of course would talk about it in much grander terms. And then on the North Korean side, as I described, their domestic situation is not good at all going into the fall. The flooding, the depleted food stocks, the poor harvest, the pressure from 5 years of economic sanctions, UN and US sanctions. Um, they also might be interested in trying to at least lock in something before the U.S. election. So I don't think that it's impossible that that could happen. Um, Both sides have denied that it can happen. I think even Ches and he, the first vice foreign minister, and maybe even the sister, has said that is not. They've called it the October surprise. They've referred to it as the October surprise, and have said it's not possible. As has the Trump administration said, it's not possible. But I think we've learned under the Trump administration in North Korea that anything is possible, and that we could see one of these things happen.
Okay, very good.
So, Sunghan,
By the way, John, the pointed out the foreign policy issues are not likely to be very influential as compared with the domestic agenda. How do you think about the Victor's comments on a
well,
possible
yeah,
October surprise?
yes, thank you. Thank you for letting me comment on it. I personally do not think that it's likely that there will be an October surprise. And the reason I say that is um, President Trump cannot introduce something that could go badly as to his election. He cannot create an issue that he cannot control. So I think President Trump will try to keep all of the issues in this election about domestic politics, where he can personally shape the narrative about the issue. I think the problem with foreign policy and the problem with a so-called October surprise is that he cannot guarantee that North Korea will behave the way it fits into his script, into his narrative. So I think he's not inclined to want to introduce a problem where he cannot manage the outcome. So I personally am skeptical that there will be a so called October surprise. I mean, most politicians, especially if you're running and you're behind, you do not want to introduce an issue where you cannot control the outcome. And I think we've all learned, and I think he knows, that trying to predict uh, how North Korea would behave in a constructive way is uncertain. So, my personal guess is that there is not going to be an October surprise.
Then how do you think President Trump will respond to possible North Korean provocations such as ICBM test?
That's a very interesting question, Sung Han. It um, President Trump has been casual in the way he's responded to North Korean provocations. When North Korea launches missiles that are short range missiles, he basically says they don't matter. They can't hit the United States, they don't matter. Now, I think that's foolish and wrong because those missiles could hit South Korea. So, it isn't that they wouldn't have an impact, but he doesn't recognize the mutual obligation that we have with South Korea, to help protect South Korea. So he's been very casual about North Korea's activities that other presidents would have found deeply objectionable. So, my guess is if there was a North Korean provocation sometime in September or October, he would try to ignore it if he could.
Hmm.
He
Okay.
would not he would not make it a great crisis unless he couldn't avoid it.
Hmm.
And I think, something that would be a provocation that he could not ignore would be, let's say, if North Korea were to go back to launch missiles where the reentry vehicle landed near Guam. If that happened, I don't think Trump could ignore it. But if it's the pattern that North Korea has demonstrated over the last year, where it's provocations kind of immediately in the area, my guess is that President Trump would just ignore it. Victor,
Hmm.
your thoughts?
So, yeah, I mean, I think in general, I think I agree with that. The only two things I would say are that yes, I do agree that they generally want to be able to control the environment going into an election. But the more he feels that he's losing, the more risk acceptant he might become, in
Hmm.
terms of, trying to do some sort of deal. The other is that I agree. If North Korea landed a reentry vehicle in the waters around Guam, that would be tremendously embarrassing for Trump because of all the personal political capital he's put into the North Korea issue, doing all these summit meetings. He hasn't really worked harder personally on any other issue, at least visibly to the public, harder on any other issue than North Korea. And so, in a sense, to avoid that sort of embarrassment, he might agree to cut a small deal to try to pacify North Korea in the run up to the election. So, no, I think there are many different calculations that could go on here, and and who knows what's happening behind the scenes in terms of facilitating dialogue between the two sides. I mean, the Moon Jae-in government now with the cabinet reshuffle has people in the NSC who are very, very practiced, expert, if you will, in promoting dialogue between North and South Korea and the United States. And, I think they will work very hard to try to make something happen between the US and North Korea, certainly in the last 2 years of President Moon's time in office.
Yeah. If
So,
you look
uh,
at Victor, sorry for interruption, but if you look at Kim Yo Jong's statement on July 10, she briefly touched upon uh, the relationship between the termination of the hostility kind of a act from the U.S. In return for the resumption of U.S. North Korea dialogue. Previously, North Korea was talking about sanctions relief, but now they are talking about how to put an end to the hostile act on the part of the United States. This might be related to the suspension of ROK U.S. joint military exercises or some friendly gesture from the U.S. or the establishment of liaison offices in respective capital of those two entities. how did you read that part, the relationship between the resumption of talks and uh, the the end
Yeah.
of the hostile relationship between North and the U.S.
Yeah, I think they clearly left the door open. I mean, the overall narrative of the statement was quite negative. But they, as North Korea often does, they always leave a door open, and the door, I think, was much more. It left a lot more room for interpretation of what the quid pro quo could be for for a resumption of dialogue, and not pinning it down on a removal of all sanctions as they
Mm,
had done in Hanoi. But if I could just step back from this very interesting granular discussion to also say that I think that while I think this is very important, but in the broader scheme of the alliance, what we've seen in the past 3 years of the Trump administration is almost a singular focus in discussions with our ally South Korea on North Korea and on SMA, and not the bigger, broader strategic issues, including the future of the alliance. And I think this is one of the biggest problems that we've seen in the last 3 years that has hurt the alliance, and why this election in the US is so important because while I do think a Biden administration would also want to see more cost sharing on the part of South Korea, certainly not as much as Trump, but more cost sharing, that would be one of many, many other issues that we would be working on in the alliance, broader strategic issues, a broader global agenda, cooperation on COVID-19 recovery, these sorts of things, which is just absent in the current
mm,
administration.
mm. John,
And
you
that's
mentioned
important.
you mentioned Joe Biden, even if he's elected, wouldn't come to the office with great new ideas. What's your take on his prospective policy on North Korea?
Well,
Do you think
yeah,
Joe Biden will be kind of a repeating strategic patience, or he is going to try to benchmark Trump's legacies?
yeah, that's a really a very interesting question, Mohan. And let me say that in the American political landscape in the Congress, the people that most supported President Trump's initiative were Bernie Sanders progressives who had a very kind of naive optimism about disarmament. The traditional foreign policy Democrats and the traditional Republicans were deeply skeptical about the initiative by President Trump and felt that President Trump was naive in negotiating something. He didn't understand the dynamics, the real dynamics, and was likely going to be taken advantage of by Kim Un Jong. The Biden presidency, if he is elected, I think comes in with basically a skepticism about what's possible. Um, I don't think they're going to ever use the word strategic patience. My sense is that that's not a credible foreign policy characterization for a Korea policy.
Mm,
But
mm,
I don't think they're going to embrace an optimistic, naive engagement with North Korea on disarmament. I think that the dominant sentiment within the Biden campaign is North Korea has to demonstrate concretely that they're willing to undertake real change before we're going to make concessions.
Mm,
It's not terribly different from where the Republicans are. President Trump is really an outlier in the political landscape. He because he doesn't have a background in foreign policy, doesn't have a deep history on these issues. He was willing to entertain ideas that were really outside of the mainstream and not really uh, wouldn't be considered by the traditional Republican or Democratic foreign policy establishment. So my sense is that the Biden presidency would say um, we're open to dialogue, but we're not going to. The starting point is not going to be any acceptance of promises. It's got to be with tangible, real steps that demonstrate that North Korea is changing its attitude. Uh,
mm.
so it would not be, they have to disarm before we talk to them, but there have to be tangible, real steps before we will consider it to be real.
Okay. Then let me turn to another subject, which I believe is also important, which is the future of USFK. As you see, uh, the Pentagon recently have decided to reduce and relocate the U.S. forces in Germany. What do you think will be uh, some strategic implications over USFK, whether President Trump is reelected or Joe Biden is elected? Do you think the future of USFK is likely to be somewhat volatile, whoever wins?
Victor,
Victor, what
let
do you
me
think?
let you to start.
Mm,
Um, thanks, John. Um, so I certainly think that if President Trump gets a second term, that he will act on his long skepticism with regard to U.S. troops in Korea. Again, at CSIS, we have a data set of all the statements that Donald Trump has made with regard to U.S. forces abroad, including in Korea, going back to 1990. And it's very clear that he has three core beliefs with regard to U.S. troops abroad. First, he thinks that they're expensive. Second, he thinks that allies like Korea free ride off the U.S. security commitment. And third, he thinks that while they are free riding off the security commitment, they are cheating the United States on trade. This has been something that he said since 1990 as a businessman, and he continues to say it today as president of the United States. So it would not surprise me at all in a second Trump administration if he were to also not just pull troops from Germany and Afghanistan and other places, but also pull some troops from Korea, also using it as leverage to try to squeeze more out of South Korea on SMA, special measures agreement. It sounds like a very sort of um, reckless policy um, that doesn't really value the equities in the alliance. But I think that's because President Trump has a very transactional view of alliances. He doesn't see them as having long-term value for the United States, and so I would be quite worried about that in the second Trump term. I'm less worried about that in a Biden administration. I think there might be some consolidation taking place. I mean, John can speak much better to that more broadly in terms of how a Biden administration would look at defense policy, but I would be very concerned about that in the second Trump administration.
But if we assume that Joe Biden is not going to be an exception in the sense that he will be focusing on uh, China rather than the Korean Peninsula, we can think of some possible scenarios in which he might think of relocation of U.S. forces in Korea to deal with China at the forefront, which happens to be South China Sea and Southeast Asian area. If you agree on that strategic kind of underpinnings of the next administration, if it is Joe Biden administration, still, do you guys believe the status as well as the size of USFK will remain more or less the same, John?
Well, Sung Han, I think you're very wise to raise this context. I think for American forces in the Pacific. Um, I've said quite publicly, I think President Trump's position is quite wrong. We are not, we are not, we don't have troops in Korea as a favor to Korea. We're not Hessians, we're not mercenaries. We have troops in Korea because it's in America's interest to support Korea's security. And it's profoundly in our interest that Korea remains strong and independent. And to start with a proposition that somehow Korea owes us something for doing what really is in our interest, in my view, is profoundly wrong. So I think the president is just wrong in the way he approaches this issue. Um, but you are right, I believe, that a Biden presidency would probably look at US forces broadly in Asia and feel that there needs to be a rebalancing away from Northeast Asia more towards Southeast Asia. That there would be as they're establishing priorities given financial constraints, that the challenge posed by China in the South China Sea would be a more immediate problem. So I think now I don't predict that there would be a significant change. My personal view on SME is that the SME negotiations would go quiet and become technical and detailed, and we wouldn't talk about it.
Mm,
It would just become a quiet deliberation, which we've always had, between our two countries.
mm.
But that
Victor,
the broader trend is going to be to put more of a focus
mhm,
on America's military posture in the South China Sea, I think, because I think that's much more in the narrative of the Biden presidency. They critique President Trump for ignoring the security problems that China has created in the South China Sea.
right.
So, a subtle shift, it wouldn't be a dramatic change. And I don't think you would find a, the Biden administration would not be confrontational about Korea. I don't think they would have the attitude that we have to try to intimidate Korea into making concessions. I think that they
Mm,
would establish quietly a framework. I think the greater challenge for Korea would be to understand how the Biden presidency is going to deal with China.
mm,
And honestly, I'd have to say I don't have in my own mind clarity about how a Biden presidency would deal with
mm,
China.
mm,
It's just the artifacts of their campaign are not clear on what they would
mm.
do.
Okay. Victor, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree, and it's interesting because it would put a different sort of pressure on South Korea. So if it were a second Trump administration, where the pressure would be, on SMA, possibly troops being pulled even as a leverage tactic on SMA. Under a Biden presidency, if John is right, and the focus will shift more, and as your question suggests, I would shift more towards looking at the China challenge in the broader Indo-Pacific. that would put a different sort of pressure on Korea because it might result in Korea having to line up on issues with regard between the United States and China that it's uncomfortable doing. So that could be things like free and open Indo-Pacific. Will Korea join that? It could be on some of these decoupling issues like economic prosperity network or Blue Dot network, or well, they've already had the conversation on Huawei and 5G. So it'd be a different type of pressure and challenge to the alliance. But I think that's actually a better challenge to the alliance because, and John and I have talked about this a lot. I mean, we believe that the U.S. and Korea need to have a very open and high-level dialogue on China, the China challenge more broadly, in the Indo-Pacific, and what it means for the alliance, and a dialogue that understands the complexities that Korea faces with regard to China, but
Mm,
also looks at it in the context of where the alliance is going, because the more China rises and the less we talk about in the alliance, the more it can be a problem for the alliance.
mm. I think the last point we can briefly touch upon is how we can save the North Korea policy from the preoccupation with China. As you know, President Trump is preoccupied with China bashing or China beating as a strategy for his own re-election, partially. But I think the same can be applied to Joe Biden, who is also very critical toward China. That means whoever wins, North Korea policy is likely to be dwarfed by the China policy or U.S.-China strategic competition. So my question is how we can save the North Korea policy from the U.S.-China strategic competition so that we can continue to move North Korea toward denuclearization. John?
Well, let me say, I think Americans have not had the deep debate that we need to have about the true geopolitical uh, challenges in Northeast Asia, the importance of South Korea in our long-term strategy, and America's strategy for this region. Um, I think too many Americans only look at the Korean Peninsula in terms of North Korean disarmament. Um, and I think many of them think as once that happens, we can just leave, and I think that's wrong. Um, in my view, we have to look at the North Korean engagement issue in the context of our long term strategy for how we want Korea to prosper and to become the strongest advocate and the strongest defender of democracy in Asia. On the Asian continent, Korea is the champion for democratic values. So we want North Korea to become part of South Korea. We don't want North Korea to become a province of China. We don't want North Korea to strengthen China. We want North Korea to strengthen South Korea. So our strategy about engagement needs to be a long term perspective about how we strengthen Korea as a champion of democracy and liberal economic order in Asia, which is, but we're not having that debate in this country. I think, I'll just be honest, I think most people look at the Korea Peninsula issue with some skepticism and worry. They're skeptical that any real agreement could be reached with Kim Jong Un, and they are worried that President Trump would sign on to something that was naive and not strategic. I think that's where the American community
Hmm.
is. I personally think we need to spend a great deal of effort creating a new consciousness, which is to say, how do we strengthen Korea over the next 30 years so it becomes the great champion of democracy in Asia? And in my view, that does mean finding a solution to the division of the peninsula.
Mm.
So I support the engagement strategy, but it needs a broader framework than the one that we have right now.
Okay. Victor, your last point for 30 seconds.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with that at all. I think the answer to the North Korea problem is found in the alliance and a strengthening of the alliance and a strengthening of the immediate environment around Korea, which is quite in flux today between China and South Korea over THAAD, between Japan and Korea, between even Russia and Korea. And so I think the priority, certainly North Korea will always be there, and there'll be have to be a way to contain and moderate that threat. But the broader challenge, I think, for the alliance going forward is how do we improve all the other pieces of the alliance, both within the alliance and around it, because I too believe that Korea is critical in the broader neoliberal order in East Asia, and that's important for both the United States and for South Korea. It's not just for South Korea; it's important for the United States as well.
Mm. Thank you for saying that. John, by the way, who do you think is going to win?
Well, uh, we're 85 days away, and lots of things can happen, uh, but President Biden has kept a very strong lead, over the last 4 months. Um,
Mm.
and if you look at the polling of popularity, 40% of Americans say they'll vote for President Trump no matter what, and 45% of the voters say they'll vote against Trump no matter what.
Mm.
So the election comes down to 15%. And for Trump to win, he has to win two-thirds of those, if you think about it.
Mm.
So I think I would just say I think it's probably more likely than not right now that Joe Biden will be the next president. But it's America is confusing, and there are lots of opportunities for things to go a little crazy here. But right now, I would say more likely than not, Vice President Biden will be the next president.
Okay. Thank you for saying that. From our very fruitful discussions, I think we are kind of reminded of the fact that our alliance relationship is very critical. And as John pointed out, we need to uh, talk about kind of our long-term strategy rather than being obsessed with kind of a short-term
Yeah.
episodic kind of issues. So in that sense, I think our alliance relationship is quite important, not just for the sake of deterring and defeating vis-a-vis North Korea, but also promoting our kind of mutual strategic interest under the very challenging, pandemic situation around the world. So I think on that positive note, I hope we can continue our conversation further. One last note, John.
Could I, yes, could I just say, Sunghan, one final comment? And I started by saying how much I admired Korea for how well they've handled the pandemic. And I mean that very sincerely. I think Korea has done a superb job. I've said for many, many years, and I believe this very much in my heart, Korea is a bigger country than Korea thinks it is. Korea doesn't have enough confidence in its larger role as a global leader. And I think you've demonstrated that with the way you've handled the COVID pandemic. And I hope that Korea finds in itself the confidence to be a bigger leader on the global stage. And I think you've earned it, and I think we should respect that.
Mm. If Korea had been located somewhere in Southeast Asia or South Pacific, Korea would have enjoyed much easier life. But
That's
now we
true.
are being surrounded by so-called global rankers. That is our destiny. So thank you for your compliments about Korea, and I really thank both of you for sharing your insights and some important strategic advice about our bilateral relationship. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Kim.
Have a good night.
Thank you.